Hi, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to Buddhism, the first week.
Hi, good
It's
morning, good evening, everyone.
it's a little bit of a sad time in the sense that we're losing our summers to COVID. I think for many of us, COVID's been quite a shock. It's revealed the fault lines in our lives. The unresolved issues. I mean, for some of us, it's been around our work. I mean, do we actually want to be in an office? Do we want to commute? Are we going to be trapped at home in our tiny apartments with our families, unable to actually be together? For some people, it was relationships with their partners. There's been a real spike in divorces because of COVID. I think for many of us, it's been our relationship with ourselves. There's been a lot of an increase in loneliness and depression, in other kinds of mental health challenges. So I think for many of us, now's the time really to ask, what does this mean for my life? Is there anything that I can take out of all of this to make it better? And at the same time, many of us have been spending much of the last year in virtual gatherings like this one. And for me, it's actually quite a wonderful thing because something like this is normal today, but would barely have been possible 10 years ago. And it's reflected in the diversity of the participants we have. I mean, not just geography, we have 54 countries signed up, but experience, practice, lineage. We have all 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. We've got representatives pretty much from all schools of Buddhism. We have a lot of people who are coming from a secular tradition or a mindfulness tradition. We have a lot of people who are brand new and have no experience whatsoever. We've also got a lot of people who are culturally Buddhist, but who've never really had much exposure to Buddhist teachings. And so that includes especially, I welcome all our friends from Bhutan who are joining. And I'm particularly pleased that we also have a lot of Christians, Hindus, Muslims, people who are not Buddhist at all, but are fascinated about meditation, what the Buddhist path has to say, the non-dual view. We also have a real diversity in terms of people's backgrounds, from CEOs, we have university professors, and we've got just ordinary people, right? I mean, it's really a snapshot of our world. And unlike many other communities, I've always loved that the Dharma community really brings people together across boundaries of class or wealth, education. Now, in terms of this program, we do have a lot of complete beginners, and I really want to make sure we meet their needs. One of them, I quote, she said, I want the absolute essentials in a simple way that relates to everyday life, the basics that anyone could get away with. Right, so I really hope we'll be in a position to offer that. And there are also a lot of Tibetan Buddhist practitioners here, Vajrayana practitioners, and many of you have sent specific Vajrayana practice questions. I'm not going to address Vajrayana questions in a public setting. I mean, for those of you who haven't seen Rinpoche's recent teaching on poison is medicine, I think he made quite a point about how, there are reasons that the Vajrayana should be kept as more of a secret practice, and we can talk about that. But for those of you who are Vajrayana practitioners, if there's enough of you that have interest and have questions, I would be happy to host separate sessions to talk about that. So we can talk about that after this. On the topic of questions, there is a link. I put it in the forum to a form where you can ask your questions. So that link is active now. It will be active throughout these teachings and also the Q&A period. After this teaching, we will have Q&A starting at 12 Pacific time. And so I'm going to go through whatever questions are there. Now, unfortunately, because this is on YouTube rather than Zoom, it's not as interactive, but the chat is open, although I won't be responding to questions from the chat. So if you do have questions, please submit them to that link in the forum. I also want to say this is a teaching rather than a practice retreat. Now, some of you, many of you actually, are interested in meditation as a practice. And we will certainly talk a lot about practice, and we will have an opportunity to do some together. But if you really would like more of an opportunity to do practice or retreat together online, again, please let me know, and I'd be more than happy to arrange that over the coming weeks. As I say, we have a really amazing virtual global community here. So much to share, so much to learn from each other. And I think it also represents something very, very interesting about the way the Dharma is coming to the modern world, which is something that Rinpoche talked a lot about during his teachings over the past couple of years. This is really something unprecedented, right? Because in Buddhist history until now, you've always had one particular lineage going from one country to one other country, sort of a linear kind of process. But now, really for the first time, we have all of the Dharma available all at once to all countries. Right? It's really unprecedented in Buddhist history. So it's an incredible opportunity and something quite wonderful, but it also comes with a number of challenges. And a big part of what we are going to talk about in these 8 weeks is some of the ways that we can misunderstand Buddhism. I mean, there are many other introductions out there, and I encourage you to read them. Some of you asked for book references. I shall certainly provide those. But most of those don't actually talk about where people can misunderstand the teachings. And it's very easy for this to happen because of different language, different culture, different symbolism. From the outside, it looks unfamiliar to many of us. And even within Buddhism, there's so much difference, right? The stark simplicity of a Zen temple compared to the abundant richness of a Tibetan temple, you would be forgiven for thinking they're completely different. But actually the underlying wisdom, the underlying truth is the same. So part of what we're going to focus on is trying to separate out what is the actual core of Buddhism, right? What is the truth that all the traditions share? And then what is something that's more superficial? And I think that's going to be important for us as we think about, out of all of the different Buddhist resources that are available to us, how can we make sense of them all? How can we determine which parts we actually need and want because they're true, and which parts are just cultural adaptations? So in a super brief summary, what would I say? Well, what is Buddhism? I would say in its view, it's a 2,500-year-old set of teachings and practices to see the truth about reality, about the world, about other people, about ourselves, and of course about our minds. In its meditations, it has a complete path for training in wisdom, in compassion and kindness, and also in meditation and mindfulness. In action, it has a way of living in the world, right? At work, in our relationships, but without getting lost, without getting caught up in the world. And as a result, it really is a way to find greater happiness and freedom, enlightenment, not just for ourselves, but for others. So that's the context, and that remains true. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of modernity. 3 in particular. It'd give us an opportunity to start to talk a little bit about what do we mean about the Buddhist middle way. And it'll also serve as an opportunity for me to give you a little background about myself, because some of you did ask about that. So the first of these is skepticism and devotion. Now, one of the things we're, I think, quite proud of in our Western intellectual history is that we've gone from the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, a time of blind faith, to the Enlightenment, right, where it was very much a time of skepticism and questioning, not just relying on tradition or blind faith. I mean, many would say we haven't really quite gone far enough. And I think, if you look at politics, you look at social media, you look at advertising, you look at fake news, you look at the 2016 US election, you look at Brexit, even the current wars around masks and vaccination, I think we can safely say there isn't perhaps enough skepticism, or perhaps the wrong kind of skepticism out there. So, we don't want to go back to this blind faith and just believing things. It's a paradox, right? Because we say we need skepticism and we need devotion. So how can we do both? Well, let me step back a little first. If you find yourself still at blind faith, at least when it comes to your Buddhist path, I think we would say it's a good thing, because at least it will keep you connected. But the Buddhist path is not a path of blind faith, although it is a path of devotion. And because you will need to cultivate some skepticism, you will need to build your experience so that you have confidence that as you proceed on the path, you're following a truth that makes sense to you. And one of the most famous stories from the sutras is when the Buddha visited a town called Kesaputta, where the inhabitants were called the Kalamas. And they'd been visited by many teachers over the years. And they said to the Buddha, hey, we've had all these different teachers, and they all offer us some different teaching. And yet they all seem to fight with each other. They all disagree and criticize each other's teachings. Who should we believe? I think it's much like trying to find a book on spirituality or meditation on Amazon, right? There are so many out there. Which ones? How do we know what to believe? And the Buddha's answer was quite interesting. He said, don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought this contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these qualities are unskillful, these qualities are blameworthy, these qualities are criticized by the wise, and these qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to harm and to suffering, then you should abandon them. So that idea is actually very contemporary, right? This idea that we really are responsible for coming up with our own point of view on how we should act in the world, what path we should follow. But it does put an enormous burden on the practitioner, which has only grown more complex as there's so many sources of information about Buddhism out there. Not just Buddhism, but the spiritual path, secular paths, self-help, psychology. And of course, as Buddhism and now mindfulness have become more popular, lots of people are borrowing the ideas and integrating it into their own teachings. And so it's increasingly difficult to know what really is Buddhism and what is Buddhism mixed with something else. And then, of course, as has always been the case, we have charlatans, we have people out there trying to make money, who are offering populism rather than truth. There's fake news in Buddhism as well, always has been. So we can be forgiven for feeling that we might be in over our heads. We need a map, we need a guidebook. It's like visiting a foreign country for the first time. And eventually we'll build one for ourselves, but that does take time. So one thing that I really want to try and help on this program is to give you some skills to do self-coaching on the path. Because even if you have a teacher, you won't be around the teacher all the time. And when it comes to the stresses of a moment where you have to make a decision, maybe a difficulty at work or an argument with your partner, you need your teachings to be available to you there and then for them to be useful. So, yeah, as I say, really what I would like to do is find a way to give you a chance to build your own map. Now, Buddhism does, as I say, it has skepticism. It has this message the Buddha gave to the Kalamas, but it also has devotion, right? The Sanskrit word bhakti has this meaning of devotion or fondness or trust or faith, even homage. Another word is shraddha, which means faith or belief or trust. Now, if you look the word up on Google, you'll find, yes, devotion has those connotations of love and loyalty and enthusiasm, but it also has the second meaning as religious worship. And I think a lot of people have that sense when they hear the word devotion applied to Buddhism. They think, ooh, this sounds an awful lot like a religion, and they start getting suspicious. We're going to find through these 8 weeks there are a lot of challenges with language, with the translation of terms, and the connotations that we apply. I mean, Rinpochet talked a lot about the difficulties of growing up in a world where we've had 2,000 years of a Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic tradition. And even words like good, they have a very particular connotation for us. Even if we're very secular, even if we just speak English, we can't really avoid the way that word comes loaded with all kinds of meanings, which we may not even be aware of. But I will say, of course, there is a bad version of devotion. It doesn't mean, of course, an unquestioned loyalty to a cult leader. And for those of you who haven't seen Wild Wild Country about the Bhagavan Sri Rajneesh, it's quite wonderful. Recently we've had the Nixium cult. There's, of course, a lot of challenges and even abuse within Buddhism itself. So we're far from free from that ourselves. But the opposite extreme isn't the answer either, right? I think a lot of modern people would say, oh, I don't have any beliefs. I don't, follow any kind of fixed things like that. But I don't think that's true, right? I mean, I think all of us believe in something. I was reminded of the nihilist anti-hero in the James Bond movie Casino Royale, Le Chiffre, where at the beginning the warlord who's looking for some unofficial financing goes to Le Chiffre and says to him, "Do you believe in God, Monsieur Le Chiffre?" And he says, "No, I believe in a reasonable rate of return." Now, I think that's a message for all of us. Yes, maybe we don't think we have a religious belief, but our life necessarily has something that's driving us. We do believe in certain things. I've always liked the quote from the Nobel economist John Maynard Keynes when he said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." This is the part I really like. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. It is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. So we will find a lot during these 8 weeks. We will talk about our underlying views, our underlying belief systems. What is it that, even if we don't necessarily articulate it every day, that is really driving the choices in our lives? So in Buddhism, yes, devotion is there, but it's devotion to the three jewels, right? The Buddha, the Dharma, which is the teachings, and the Sangha, which is the community of practitioners. And we'll talk about this more in future weeks, but if you were to boil it down to just one idea, it really is devotion to the truth. So, I invite you, maybe not right now, but just as you, maybe after this course, just think about it for yourself. What is your North Star, right? What do you devote your time and energy and attention and resources towards? And maybe actually you can even start out by writing down what you think your purpose is and then comparing how you actually spend your days. Because it turns out very few of us are even aligned with our stated purpose, let alone what we think we would like if we retire or if we are on our deathbed. There's a thought experiment that people often ask, if you knew you were going to die in 6 months, what would you do? For most of us, it would be something different from the way we're choosing to spend our days today. And yet, one day leads to another, the days lead into months, which become years, and somehow we never seem to change our habits. Psychologist Dan Gilbert, he has this lovely idea that our current self is very bad at predicting what our future self wants. And I think that's a real cause for much of the unhappiness that we end up finding ourselves with in our lives. I will say, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you will hear me use the word Rinpoche, and I just want to say what that is. It's actually a word that literally means precious one. It's an honorific. It's the way we refer to our teachers. Within the Indian and the Tibetan traditions, I think the importance of lineage, the gratitude to one's teachers, is really held as important. Actually, much as it was, I think, even in the ancient Greek philosophy tradition. Rinpoche loves to tell a story about the great sitar player Ravi Shankar, who once, when he was playing in London, his guru, Alauddin Khan, was in the audience. And I think Ravi Shankar did not know that before the performance, but he spotted him before he was starting to play. And before he even started, he put down his sitar and he walked off the stage and into the audience, and he prostrated 3 times to his teacher. And then he went back and started his performance. Yeah, I've always loved that story. I think it says something quite important about being willing to have the humility to acknowledge who have been our teachers. Basically, where have we found wisdom in our lives? On the topic of teachers, though, much though it is important to learn to cultivate devotion to the teacher and the teaching, especially if you're following a Vajrayana path, it's also important not to, as we said, fall into blind faith. And I think to become aware of how our relationship with our teacher is driven by our own projections. Any of you who've ever been in therapy will be familiar with ideas of transference and countertransference, right? How we project our own hopes and fears, our own unresolved issues onto our therapist. And actually, it turns out we all do something very, very similar with our teachers on the spiritual path. So I invite you to approach your teacher with that kind of attitude of noticing what are your hopes and fears and projections, and maybe think less about what does that say about your teacher and more about what does that say about you. Ideally, your teacher really should be not just an embodiment of wisdom and a skillful coach, but a compassionate mirror, someone who can allow you to see yourself more clearly, and where you can really see your ego games being played out. Like a therapist, but more so, right? Because it's not just about your inner psychological world, but your innermost world of awareness and wisdom. I've been just to say a little about me. I've been a student of Rinpoche's for a long time. I'm very fortunate to have received many teachings from him in many places. From high mountains in Bhutan to beside the Ganges, even under the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya. So it means a lot to me to be able to share what I've learned with you. Although in my case, my first encounter with Vajrayana was quite negative. I had a very reactive attitude to seeing the paintings of demons, seeing the way that people seem to be so clingy and so subservient to their teachers. It didn't sit well with me at all. So I can understand why people may see that whole scene and decide it's not for them. I can also really understand why secular Buddhists find a lot to disagree with in Buddhism. But I really would like to invite you, especially if you're one of those secular Buddhists yourself, to approach this with an open mind, if only for these 8 weeks. I mean, it's very easy to judge things we don't understand, right? To think, oh, it's ancient, it's outdated, it's old, it's unfamiliar. Maybe we also try and force Buddhism into our own terms, right? We think, well, is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? Is it a psychology, a mind training, a path of personal transformation? Well, yes, I mean, it's all of those things, and perhaps it's none of those things. One of my favorite Zen stories is called A Cup of Tea. So Nan-in, a Japanese Zen master, was receiving a university professor who came to inquire about Zen. Nan-in served tea. He poured his visitor's cup full, and then kept on pouring. The professor watched the overflow until he could no longer restrain himself. "It is overfull. No more will go in." "Like this cup," Nan-in said, "you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" So this is how, this is the first of the 101 Zen stories. And I, again, would really invite you to approach these teachings with openness. Try and bring a beginner's mind, an empty cup, as best you can. I know that's not always easy. Personally, I'm really grateful that we do have Christians, Hindus, Muslims here. I mean, I think it's wonderful. It says a lot that that you are open to questioning what you have learned and hearing things from different traditions. I mean, I believe that Buddhism really offers something that goes beyond all countries, all nationalities, all human social systems. It really taps into something much more fundamental about what it is to be human, even what it is to be conscious. Rinpochet has talked quite a lot over the years, more recently, about what will happen when AI, artificial intelligence, takes over. Yes, and of course, impacts for our jobs and livelihoods and our sense of purpose. But I think it raises a whole other interesting set of questions about what if these AIs themselves start approaching consciousness? How then will we relate to them? And it's not a joke. What if they suffer? What if they want to study and practice Dharma? How will that go? So we can talk more about that also. Second big theme is about rationality and going beyond rationality. Again, the modern world has gone from irrational to rational, scientific, evidence-based. But Buddhism asks us to go beyond the limits of rationality, to embrace a world of paradox. And again, as before, it's not going backwards towards irrational, but going forwards in such a way that we can include and hold both rational and beyond rational. Now, we do still have to go beyond irrationality. So if you're someone who hasn't yet fully embraced rationality, perhaps this is an opportunity for you. I mean, one of the 3 poisons that's spoken about in the original Pali teachings is Moha, which is defined as ignorance, in particular ignorance of cause and effect, or ignorance of reality. Which, we could paraphrase and say that's a form of irrationality. There are many teachings and practices to help us through that, but one in particular that I'd like to offer now is in the Vajrayana and the Nindra, which is the preliminary teachings. They have 4 thoughts to turn the mind away from samsara and encourage you to practice. So I'll just paraphrase them here. I mean, the first is just appreciate the opportunity that we have to hear these teachings, to have enough space in our lives to actually do something with them, to even have the interest that it attracts us in the first place. I mean, now that we've found this, what on earth will we do? There's a lovely poem, The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. It's often used in mindfulness programs, which has the line, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Yeah, it's the same idea. We have this freedom right now. We don't know if we're always going to have it. Are we really using it, right? Are we really thinking about what is most purposeful to us? I think next, impermanence, right? I mean, we tend to not pay attention to how things pass, how opportunities go. It leaves things unfinished. I mean, how many New Year's resolutions do we not complete with the idea that we'll get round to it one day? I think the third thought is the defect of samsara, or worldly life, right? We keep trying to fix our outer life. It never seems to work. Now, I'm not saying we should be careless or lazy or just give up, far from it. But start to ask ourselves, is there perhaps more that we're not paying attention to? Finally, the idea of action, right? Karma. The idea that what we do really matters, right? So our current actions, our current thoughts really determine tomorrow and the years ahead. So all of these are ways of saying, yeah, we can't just be blasé, not really pay attention, not care. There are good reasons for paying attention to the way we relate to how we think, how we approach our lives, how we approach Buddhism. It's not just Buddhist, by the way. I mean, this is also something in Western philosophical tradition. I mean, Stoicism has this also. And actually, you can look at the great Stoics, like Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. They have very similar ideas. And I just looked at Marcus Aurelius, and I found 4 of his maxims that really match onto the 4 thoughts. He says, think of the life you have lived until now as over, as if you're a dead man, and then see what is left as a bonus. And secondly, he says, you could leave your life right now. So let that determine what you do and say and think. And then he says, it's time you realize that you have something in you more powerful and miraculous than the things that affect you and make you dance like a puppet. Yeah, this idea that we don't just have to respond to kind of social media and ads that we see on Facebook and Google. We don't have to live our lives by these people who are manipulating and making us dance. And then finally he says, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. So yes, I mean, Buddhism cares a lot about rationality, right? A correct understanding and relationship to reality, seeing the truth. And this love of truth is very much, shared with Western philosophy. But here there's even more, right? We'll say, yes, there's something else that maybe Western philosophy hasn't necessarily seen. I do want to touch on something one of you wrote. You quoted the American Buddhist teacher Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal, who said, if you cannot explain it to a 6-year-old, you do not know it yourself. And I really sympathize with that. I'm not entirely sure we're going to be able to manage to do that. Because although Buddhism is experientially very simple, it's complicated only because of the confusion we bring to it. I mean, there's a lovely story by David Foster Wallace called This is Water. And at one part, there's these 2 young fish swimming along in the ocean, and they come up against an old fish, and he says, hey, good morning. How you doing? And he says, how's the water today? And then he swims off, and the 2 young fish look at each other, and they say, what is water? I think that's really starting to point us to what is beyond our normal rationality. I mean, the teachings often say that our own awareness, right, the nature of our own mind, is too close. It's too simple, like our own eyelashes, like saying we can't see the forest for the trees. And so, yes, sometimes cowherds can get things that university professors might not, and vice versa. I mean, sometimes university professors can get things a cowherd might not. But it's really not about the contents necessarily of our thought and our mind, as much as the relationship between our mind and our awareness, right? The contents and the container. We might say the fish and the water. If we're just focusing only on rationality, we might never step back and see the broader container that is our awareness. It's very hard for us to step back, right, to really have a beginner's mind. So the path is going to be an undoing. But it's not about erasing the mind, right? It's not like trying to clear a hard disk or something. It's not trying to get back to a pure blank slate, not that we ever had one. that would be impossible. It's also useless. I mean, you can see the effects of people who unfortunately have that when you look at stories of people with traumatic brain damage. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Oliver Sacks called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's a literal truth. It's a true story. Now, I mean, could you say that man has unlearned something? Well, yes, of course, but not in a way that's helpful. Yeah, we still need our maps of the world. We still need a way to get through life. So it can't only be about changing our thoughts, although we will need to change some of them as we proceed along the path. I think it's more around how do we change our relationship to our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences, our mind. Indeed, change our relationship to our ideas of self, others, world. Is this difficult? Can you explain it to a 6-year-old? I don't know. I mean, can you explain how to make a chocolate cupcake to a 6-year-old? Maybe. I mean, can you explain how to make a Viennese Sachertorte? I mean, maybe it's a little harder. Now, does that mean we shouldn't try to teach people how to make a Sachertorte? I don't think we're saying that either, right? By the way, in case none of you have experienced that, it's one of my favorite Viennese specialities, right? It's a dense chocolate cake with a thin layer of apricot jam and coated in dark chocolate icing on the top and the sides. But it's well known as being a very hard and complex cake to make. So, yes, that's rationality. Now, going beyond rationality, and we're going to spend a lot of our time during the 8 weeks on that, so I won't say too much right now, just to say it will be a big theme. And those of you who come, especially from a Zen tradition, you'll be familiar with this because paradox and going beyond rationality is very much a theme in the Zen teachings and practices. Many of you may have heard the famous koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? On its surface, it literally makes no sense, right? It's an irrational statement or question. And yet, it's key to the practice. So, for those of us who are stuck in our rationality, maybe there's something that we're missing. Maybe there's something we haven't fully understood yet. I mean, I'm trained as a scientist, as a theoretical physicist. I actually attended lectures by Stephen Hawking when he was still able to use his hand to operate his speech synthesizer. So yes, I appreciate rationality. But there's so much that rationality it doesn't cover even in the world of physics, right? I mean, I won't go into that, but there's a lot there. And in our modern world, as we said, there's so much in politics, in advertising, and so forth, where we are not rational. But I do want to say to all the secular Buddhists and the skeptics and the rationalists out there, please bear with it, even if initially you might think this idea of going beyond rationality makes no sense. And also for those of you who really want things to be simple, please don't give up if the path at times may seem difficult. I mean, the great American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said, I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. Yeah, any of you who've tried to master anything in life, you know that getting to the wisdom of simplicity, you can't get there by ignoring the complexity. Yeah? Same with difficult decisions in life. To pretend they're simple and try and solve them by flipping a coin doesn't actually mean you've made a wise choice. And those of you watching the Olympics, right? The simplicity or seeming simplicity and effortlessness of a perfectly executed gymnastic move or a beautifully played piano sonata, that only comes after a lot of practice and hard work. Why should we expect Buddhism to be different? Yeah, Einstein said, make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And very similar and very true also in Buddhism. And I think Rinpochet has often expressed his concern that I think many contemporary explanations of Buddhism are going a little too far perhaps towards populism and simplicity. And if you do that, then all you're going to do is relate the teachings back to what you knew before you started. It reminds me of, coming from England myself, how if you go to the Costa del Sol in Spain, you will find beautifully arrayed English fish and chip shops. So yes, it's very familiar, it's very simple, it's easy to get fish and chips in Spain. But are you really experiencing anything to do with Spain? So the third thing I want to just touch on is this idea of practical versus useless. The modern world really values practicality, productivity, efficiency, return on investment. And yet Buddhism is asking us to look at uselessness, looking at being rather than doing, looking at things that go beyond worldly concerns rather than just following worldly concerns. And again, it's not about becoming impractical or about being lazy and wasting time, but rather a way of holding practical and beyond practical together. Because if we're just going to measure our lives, or indeed measure Buddhism by what it can do for our worldly life, we're never really going to get the full benefit out of the path. The path does involve a general reorientation from doing, accomplishing goals, to being, so that eventually you'll come out at a place where you are doing with being rather than doing without that being. And we'll talk much more about the qualities of being, the mindfulness, the intentionality, the purposefulness, the compassion and kindness, and the wisdom, right? All these things are part of what can mark the way we approach whatever it is that we're doing. But that's, on top of and beyond the doing itself. Now, some of us may not yet be practical, and for us, I would say Buddhism certainly doesn't celebrate being impractical. In fact, in Dharma, the word practice and the word practical in English, they both come from the Greek origin, right? Praktikos, which means fit for action, or practical also means active, effective, vigorous. And there's two common faults that we may have, right? One is it's easy to get stuck in theory, right? We can argue about what Buddhism says, we can read lots of books, we can impress our friends with our knowledge, but not necessarily put any of it into practice. And I think there's a second way that we can fail to put things into practice, which is through a lack of energy or diligence or effort. And the path has antidotes, right? We have in the Mahayana path the practice of the 6 paramitas. The fourth is virya, which is energy or diligence or enthusiasm, which is all about how can we cultivate this sort of very practical and engaged attitude to our path, which is then the foundation for going beyond practicality. Rinpochet has also said many times, don't make yourself a burden on others. And ever since Jack Kerouac wrote The Dharma Bums back in the late 50s, Dharma has always attracted its fair share of hippies and dropouts. And of course, they're welcome. But in the same way that Buddhism is not about attachment to the samsaric worldly life, it's also not about attachment to being a dropout. So, what does it mean to go beyond the concerns of this world, right? And of course, Rinpoche says, even meditation itself is useless. We're literally doing nothing. We're not accomplishing anything while we're sitting on our cushion. It's not productive. And I know, of course, contemporary mindfulness is trying to give us a benefit in psychological or business terms, but that's really something quite different from a Buddhist practice of learning just to be. There's a lovely Taoist story from the Chuang Tzu, from the first chapter. It's called Free and Easy Wandering, and even the chapter title is beautiful. So Hui Tzu said to Chuang Tzu, I have a big tree of the kind men call shu. Its trunk is too gnarled and bumpy to apply a measuring line to. its branches too bent and twisty to match up to a compass or square. You could stand it by the road, and no carpenter would look at it twice. Your words, too, are big and useless, and so everyone alike spurns them. Chuang Tzu said, "Maybe you've never seen a wild cat or a weasel. It crouches down and hides, watching for something to come along. It leaps and races east and west, not hesitating to go high or low, until it falls into the trap and dies in the net. Then again there's the yak, big as a cloud covering the sky. It certainly knows how to be big, though it doesn't know how to catch rats. Now you have this big tree and you're distressed because it's useless. Why don't you plant it in not even anything village, or the field of broad and boundless? Relax and do nothing by its side, or lie down for a free and easy sleep under it. Axes will never shorten its life. Nothing can ever harm it. If there's no use for it, how can it ever come to grief or pain?" And especially if you practice the highest teachings in the Tibetan tradition, Mahamudra or Mahasandhi, you'll find this praise of uselessness throughout these teachings. One of my favorite prayers from Dudjom Rinpoche, Rinpoche's grandfather, is calling the Lama, has this line, "Let this life be spent in this state of uninhibited naked ease." So yes, we will see a lot of these ideas of uselessness, of ease, of seemingly just being, somebody who doesn't want to accomplish anything in the world. But that's not the whole story, right? So we need to be able to be practical and useful and at the same time go beyond. Again, just a little about me. In my profession, I'm a business school professor and I'm a coach to some, successful people in business and government and society. So I say this to reassure you that I understand the world of being practical, even though I'm steeped in the non-dual path. But I'm also very aware of the difficulty of making change in our lives, or following any kind of path or practice. So I hope we'll have a chance to talk about this also. Okay, I'm going to pause for a break now for 10 minutes. But after the break, I want to come back and talk about the goals of Buddhism. What is the path about? What can we hope to achieve or accomplish? And also talk a little bit about what have you said you'd like out of the path. And if you have a moment for reflection over the next 10 minutes, I would like to invite you just to write down, please feel free if you want to write it in the stream on YouTube in the chat, what drew you to Buddhism? What are you hoping to get out of the path? Or indeed, if you've come for mindfulness, out of mindfulness or vipassana, whatever you're looking for. Yeah. And please don't be shy. Don't say you have no hopes. Unless you've already achieved a state very close to enlightenment, we all still are functioning in this world of hope and fear. But I would like to invite you just to think about it for a moment, because I think this idea of purpose or goal or intention is quite important. So we'll come back in 10 minutes and talk about that. See you in 10 minutes. Right, so welcome back, and I'm seeing some of you are writing in the chat, so thank you. Yeah, and again, it is really important to spend time to think about why we do things. And this is true just as much in our ordinary worldly lives as it is in our Dharma practice. So I looked across all, not just what you're saying here, but what you wrote in your registration forms. And I would say there's three kind of broad themes of things that people are looking for. And I would say the first is what I would call outer things. So around our lifestyle, our behavior, the way we show up in the world. So, the typical kinds of things you see in self-help, positive psychology, leadership, coaching, right? Things like better relationships at home and work, how to be good with our kids, better parents, how to be more successful in dating, no less. Of course, people are interested in applying Dharma to the workplace, right? How can they be better leaders? Develop a kinder, more productive, more engaged workplace. Rinpochet often talks about King Ashoka, the great patron of Buddhism in ancient India. And he's often said, look, if we really ever expect to have a Buddhist society, we will need our kings and our CEOs to be Buddhists too, right? So we can't think of this as just something that doesn't impact our outer world. And of course, there's a lot of people, especially in the West now, who are very interested in engaged Buddhism, right? Social justice, climate change, environmental problems, racism, Black Buddhism, discrimination of all kinds, LGBTQ, etc. Right? Just to say, the world, of course, is in difficult state externally, and I think a lot of people are asking, well, surely Buddhism has some kind of role to play here. What is this role? So that's one big topic, right? The outer world, and how can Buddhism help us live better in the world. I think the second big area is what I would call the inner world, right? It's the world of kind of our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences. That's what a lot of us want to be happy, right? We don't want to suffer. I saw someone, Abby wrote on the thread, she has generalized anxiety disorder and is looking to Buddhism to help alleviate her anxiety. Many people now are suffering from mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, stress, trauma. It's becoming the biggest health problem in the world, right? But there's also a positive side of experience, right? A lot of people are looking for peace, happiness, experiences of the sort of experiences we have with beauty, wonder, joy. And we know that the outer and the inner are, yes, of course they're related, but we also know they're not that tightly related, right? We know money on its own won't make you happy, right? As the Beatles sang, money can't buy you love, right? Even from work in trauma, right? We know that the difference between an experience becoming trauma and creating PTSD versus leading to post-traumatic growth has less to do with the experience and more to do with the way we internally make meaning. I think in general, right, especially in the West, since the 60s, there's been much more interest in the path of happiness rather than just the path of outer success. So I think there's a big area there of kind of what I would call, the ordinary experiences of happiness and sadness. But there's also another set of experiences which I would call extraordinary experiences. So there's a lot of interest now amongst peak experiences, flow experiences, when athletes or performers are in the zone, when the self seems to fall away. Maslow, Abraham Maslow, the psychologist who wrote about this a lot, here's how he described it. He said, the feelings of limitless horizons opening up to the vision, the feeling of being simultaneously more powerful and also more helpless than one ever was before, the feeling of great ecstasy and wonder and awe, the loss of placing in time and space with, finally, the conviction that something extremely important and valuable had happened, so that the subject is to some extent transformed and strengthened even in her daily life by such experiences. I think another theme we're seeing a lot of these days actually is the rise of psychedelics, especially actually in therapeutic applications, PTSD, etc. And it seems to be that they are quite remarkable. I mean, far more so than antidepressants. If any of you haven't come across Michael Pollan's lovely book, How to Change Your Mind, I recommend it to you. But he's not at all a Buddhist. I mean, very kind of skeptical himself, but ends up with quite a Buddhist view after having tried all manner of psychedelics and experienced the effects for himself. And he says, this sense of merging into some larger totality is, of course, one of the hallmarks of the mystical experience. Our sense of individuality and separateness hinges on a bounded self and a clear demarcation between subject and object. But all that may be a mental construction, a kind of illusion, just as the Buddhists have been trying to tell us. The psychedelic experience of non-duality suggests that consciousness survives the disappearance of the self, that it is not so indispensable as we and it like to think. Personally, I love the fact that somebody, who comes in as skeptical as him, is not a Buddhist, can nevertheless come to that conclusion. But yes, this whole question of spiritual experience, right? Even in a modern world where many of us no longer wish to partake of religion, I think a lot of us would identify as spiritual but not religious. So there's this idea, yes, there's still these experiences. There's some sense of spiritual awe. There's some sense of something bigger. And I do think, by the way, as we now start to see technology give us immersive virtual reality, I think we're going to start to see not just psychedelics, but I think a lot of technologically induced states where if we're not careful, I think we'll find that the big tech companies will start to have more and more control over our experience. And if we don't find a way to kind of manage our side of that, I think it could become a little bit like the way we've become so vulnerable in the face of the food industry, where they've found they've engineered the sweet spot of sweet and salty and fatty just so that we buy their cheap junk food. And what have we seen? We've seen a worldwide explosion in obesity, right? And I think there's a lot of people now concerned that our world of advertising, our world of social media, the internet in general, there's so many PhDs in psychology in Silicon Valley whose work is about how to get you addicted to their apps or their websites. Yeah, there's a wonderful book by Nir Eyal, who was one of these himself, right? He's called Hooked, where he was explaining how do you get people addicted. And he wrote another book trying to then kind of make amends for everything he wrote in his first book. But yeah, the reality is, I think going forwards, we are going to be in a world where the capitalist system is doing its best to get us addicted to products and services. And they're finding better and better ways of doing this, right? And now our minds and our emotions are fair prey. So if we don't find a way of learning to kind of achieve some mastery of our inner world, I think we're going to be quite vulnerable. And there's another set of concerns, which is ethics, right? How to live a good life. Many of you wrote about purpose, how to be a good person, how to be a kind person, how to be authentic, how to live according to values. What does it mean to have secular or humanistic ethics in a post-religious world? What does Buddhism have to say about these topics? What does Buddhist ethics actually mean? I think another big question is purpose, right? Life design, identity. What should I do with my life? Is there a Buddhist perspective on that? We kind of know that consumerism's not the way. Most of us realize materialism has its limits. There's been a big rise in minimalism, decluttering, focusing, Zen, mindfulness, all these ideas that Life has become too complicated, too busy, too much stuff, right? So, what if anything does Buddhism have to offer us there? I think finally in this domain of the inner world, and also with purpose, Rinpoche is also talking about this now. As artificial intelligence comes, and we have this coming identity crisis, and the machines take our jobs, who are we then, right? So many of us are so identified with our work. When we no longer have work in the ordinary sense, how will we make sense of our lives? And Rinpoche says, I agree. I think the need will become stronger than ever to find a way of making sense of who we are as people, as humans, as a society, that doesn't just refer back to the conventional ways of thinking about meaning. And I think Buddhism has an awful lot to offer here. So that's the second, or the inner. The third is the innermost, which is the domain of awareness or wisdom. We've often had this idea that since there's more to life than this, right? There's something else going on behind appearances. Most famously in the scene in The Matrix with the red pill and the blue pill, right? Do we really want to wake up to what reality is really about? Yeah, so we hear words like wisdom, self-awareness, recognizing our true nature. And this has been a concern of Western philosophy and, of course, Eastern wisdom traditions since the very beginning. I mean, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, 4th century before the Common Era, was famous for the quote, "Know thyself." That's always been an aim of Western philosophy. What does it mean to live authentically, right? To answer the question, we have to know who we really are, because authenticity is about being true to who you really are. And if you don't know that, how can you be authentic? Yeah, Buddhism, of course, goes a little further, a little deeper, talking about the nature of phenomena, the nature of mind. And all this then leads to conversations about awakening, liberation, freedom, enlightenment. These are big, big words. Well, we'll talk about this over the coming weeks as well. But I would say that just in the same way that the inner world is more, and indeed a different dimension from the outer world, the innermost world is actually more and different from the inner world also. Because if we're able to shift our awareness, shift our way of being, it changes our relationship to all our thoughts, our emotions, our self. Right back to that Michael Pollan quote. The idea that when he says the psychedelic experience of non-duality suggests that consciousness survives the disappearance of the self. Yeah, so what is this? I mean, clearly beyond the domain of the inner world of psychology, because psychology is still about a self, right? What happens when you have no self, when you just have awareness? What is that? So yeah, we'll talk a lot about that too. And I will say, I mean, of course you can compare this to the Western psychological tradition, most famously expressed in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the outer level you have the material needs, basic needs of food and water and safety. Then the inner level you have psychological needs, how to be happy, how to build friendships, intimate relationships, how to build a purposeful life. Then self-fulfillment, right? How to achieve one's full potential, how to live authentically. I mean, he called this self-actualization. But it was only much later in his life, actually, that he came to accept the idea of beyond worldly. I mean, he called it self-transcendence. He called it, the transcendence of identity, the Eastern, as he put it, goal of ego transcendence and obliteration, of leaving behind self-consciousness and self-observation. I mean, he argued that, he said, it looks as if the best path to this goal for most people is via achieving identity, a strong, real, conventional self, and via basic need gratification. Yeah, I'm not sure a Buddhist perspective would agree with that, but we can certainly talk about that. But just to say, I mean, these three, right, the outer, the inner, the innermost, the worldly, the psychological, and the world of wisdom and awareness, these are part of the human condition. These have been timeless for thousands and thousands of years. They cut across all cultures and all human eras. I mean, you might ask, well, what if my only aspirations are just worldly happiness and success? Can I still be a Buddhist? Of course, right? I mean, Buddhism is never going to begrudge you the use of the path for whatever purposes you wish. And, a lot of the Western interest, the contemporary interest in mindfulness, compassion, self-compassion, very much why we're using it, right? We're applying it for, in some cases, outer things. We talk about mindful parenting, we talk about mindful leadership, and of course inner things. There's so much now mindfulness in psychology and therapy. I mean, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is one of the most effective evidence-based therapies now. So yeah, it's really helping people. And yet there is more, right? So I wouldn't want you to stop just there. I mean, Rinpochet says, it's a bit like you losing gold leaf to wipe your bottom. Perhaps a slightly less dramatic example, you could say it's a bit like using your $5,000 laptop as a doorstop. I mean, yes, it functions for that purpose, but you're not using all that it can be. Yeah, and it would be a shame if you were to learn about Buddhism, engage in the Buddhist path, and never give yourself the chance to find out what its real intention is. So yes, I mean, Buddhism is in no way against you being successful. It's no way against you being happy, far from it. Although, it would question if you put your quest for success above your spiritual path, or indeed if you put your quest for happiness above your spiritual path. I mean, Rinpoche's first book, or I shouldn't say first, but his second book was called Not for Happiness. And I don't think, his point is very clear. It's not that we don't want happiness. Of course we do, but it's just if that's the only thing you look to Buddhism to give you, you're missing something. And actually, again, this is one of these sort of paradox things, because all of these are welcome. I mean, I was just noticing even His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he talks about Buddhism, he gives all three of these, right? So he talks about the outer world. He says, my religion is very simple. My religion is kindness. Yeah, how can I just live in the world in a way that's kind? He also talks about the inner world. He says, I believe the purpose of life is to be happy. From the moment of birth, every human being wants happiness and does not want suffering. Neither social conditioning, nor education, nor ideology affect this. But then he also says, in all the orders of Tibetan Buddhism, their systems come down to the same final principle called ordinary consciousness, or innermost awareness, which is the basis of the appearance of all the round of suffering and also the basis of liberation. Although it's difficult to pinpoint the physical base or location of awareness, it is perhaps the most precious thing concealed within our brains. Yeah, so just to say, all of those things, really, they're part of it. And if all of that seems perhaps a little much, I want to give a very everyday example. This is the singer Billie Eilish, the heroine of Gen Z everywhere. There's a nice article about her interview in The Guardian a few days ago. She said, since I was a kid, my dad and I have always talked about a certain type of person who's so insecure or hyper-aware and self-conscious that they never move in a weird way or make a weird face because they always want to look good. I've noticed that, and it makes me so sad. If you're standing always a certain way, walking in a certain way, and always have your hair just so, it's such a loss to always try to always look good. It's such a loss of joy and freedom. Yeah, so I think it's worth reflecting on that, right? I mean, maybe for us, we're not concerned about having our hair just so, or maybe we are, but what are all of the ways that we are not free because of our own need to look good, or to be liked, or to fit into social conventions? So, this idea that actually we all get caught up playing this worldly game, And so much of the time we don't even notice it. So yes, of course, we should aspire for enlightenment. But I think it can be good to start with just looking at some of the very basic ways that we are not free in our day-to-day lives. Now in Buddhism, this idea of motivation or aspiration is it's a practice, right? Given the importance of choosing the right goal, of course. Taking refuge is, for all Buddhists, kind of the most foundational way that you kind of define yourself to be a Buddhist. I mean, I guess in Mahayana it becomes about bodhicitta, the bodhicitta and bodhisattva vow. And for Mahayana Buddhists in particular, our aspiration is no longer just about what Buddhism can do for us, but about all beings. Partly because in the Mahayana, even the idea of self is seen as a cognitive distortion. It's a mistake. It may seem far beyond us today to understand what that might mean, but that's why it's a practice, right? Even just focusing our energy on thinking of others and thinking less about ourselves. I mean, it's good for our mental health, right? Less self-obsession, less narcissism is certainly good for our state of mind, but it's also a good training just to sort of decrease our self-obsession and self-clinging. Rinpochet talks about, in his most recent talk on karma, how, yes, we create karma through body, speech, and mind, but of all of those, mind is the most important, right? Our intention, our aspiration is the most important. And that makes sense, right? Our life now is a result of where we have been investing time and energy and attention and resources over the years in the past. And our life tomorrow will be a consequence of our choices on how to invest these things going forwards, right? So that's really determined by what we think is important. And our purpose, our motivation is a very core part of our identity. And back to authenticity. Now some of you may say, this whole idea of deciding what do I want, what is my life really about? How do I design a life? It seems like a lot. Yeah, fair enough, it is a lot. And so Rinpoche says, look, for many of us as beginners, we really don't know what we're praying for. Partly because, as Shantideva says in the Bodhicharyavatara, we don't really know what's good for ourselves or good for others. So we aspire and pray that we will be able to do what the Bodhisattvas and Buddhas of the past and the present and the future do. Which in this case means we aspire for the enlightenment of all sentient beings. Right? It's the highest good, namely enlightenment, for the greatest number of people, namely all sentient beings. Now, right now, this probably sounds a little bit just like words. Might feel religious, irrational, impractical, but we'll keep coming back to this. And even now, I'd like to just transition from the idea of our aspiration for enlightenment to talk a little bit about, well, what is the Buddha, right? The final goal of our path is to become like Buddhas, right? To become Buddhas, to become enlightened. So the word Buddha, right, in Pali and Sanskrit, it actually has these twin meanings of both being awake as in a state and awakened as a result. Right, so the state, especially if you look in the higher paths, the Vajrayana, they say that we already have this awakened nature within us. We just aren't aware of it. Right, so there's that notion we already are all Buddhas, if only we knew. The example often given is the poor man who lives in a shack above a buried treasure and has never discovered it, if only he knew. But also awakened has this connotation of there's a process, there's a path, right? There's dirt on our window which we need to get rid of. Okay, so what are we awakening from and to? Well, the word awake obviously brings us to sleep. Right? We're waking from the sleep, dullness, mindlessness, right? How often do we go through our lives completely asleep? I mean, psychology has run some experiments and found that basically half of our waking lives we're completely unaware of what we're doing. Yeah? Completely mindless. What does that mean, right? among other things, well, it turns out that when we're mindless, we're actually much more likely to be unhappy. Right? The article is called "An Unhappy Mind as a Wandering Mind." We also wake from dreams, right? From nightmares, from things that are not real, things that are constructions of our hope and our fear, from sleepwalking, like zombies caught in our own worlds, unaware of other people, unaware of the world outside, what's happening in society or the planet. Awakening to, well, the truth of ourselves, others, and the world. In Buddhism, we don't believe in evil, right? It's not that idea of sort of original sin. If things aren't working in the world, it's because of ignorance, right? It's our inability to see the truth. That's what binds us. So a big part, the biggest part of our path, is really learning to see the truth, to get rid of and undo this ignorance. Also awakening then to our true nature, to authenticity, sometimes said our Buddha nature. Again, we'll talk about this more. That sounds perhaps a little religious, a little bit strange. So let's understand what is meant by that. But certainly this notion that if our world is created by our minds, in the sense of we project everything, then awakening to the nature of our minds would seem to be quite a good idea. I think Buddha also has this connotation of wisdom and knowledge, right? This idea of kind of knowing both the nature of things and knowing all that there is to know. Wisdom actually is similar in that sense to the Western philosophical tradition. It also has when we think about the goal, there's an interim step. We'll hear the word nirvana. Actually, in the Sanskrit, nirvana means blown out, right, or extinction. Right? So what's being blown out? Well, extinguishing the fires of attachment, of aversion, anger, ignorance. In other words, all our reactive and negative emotions. We all know that when we're caught in negative emotions, in selfishness, in narcissism, we're not our best for ourselves or for those around us, right? So we know, even in our ordinary psychology, that that's a good idea. But nirvana also has this connotation of freedom, right? Liberation. So Sanskrit vimukti. Liberation from suffering, from samsara. And traditionally, it's the idea of the round, the cycle of rebirths. And if that sounds a little much for us, we can certainly understand it as liberation from our habitual patterns. I should also say we hear the word mind a lot. Now, the most modern Western cognitive science doesn't believe in a sharp division between mental and emotional processes, right? The idea of heart and mind are not two separate things. And certainly, if you look at the Sanskrit word chitta, it doesn't have a connotation of being purely mind. And a lot of Asian languages have that. I don't speak Chinese, but I'm told by my Chinese friends that the word jin has a similar connotation of referring to both heart and mind, right? It's non-dual in that sense. But so enlightenment, right? What does it mean? That's part of the challenge. We really don't understand it. Actually, it's intended to refer to a state of non-dual realization that, by definition, is beyond our conceptual understanding. Right? We hear about a finger pointing to the moon. All we can really do is talk about the finger. We can't talk about the moon. It's beyond us. So it's used as a word to inspire, right? Even if we can't necessarily articulate it. Which is often why you'll see in Buddhist imagery, you'll see, the Buddha with halos, with light, all that kind of stuff. Not to be taken literally, but symbolically, right? This idea of enlightenment, lit up. Actually, I couldn't help it on the topic of Billie Eilish. I couldn't help thinking about the contemporary slang of lit, right? Which I know has been slang for over a century. It used to refer to being drunk, but now it refers to something that's exciting or excellent. Right? You'll see it a lot. It's used in rap, and of course, it has this idea of referring to the look on someone's face when light is shining on it. But it's this idea of when people are suddenly made happy by something, it can have a similar effect, right? Hence, excellence, excitement, lit. But this idea, I think, of the highest happiness or excitement or rapture can often be confused for enlightenment. I think not least of which because I think in the Western tradition, Western religious tradition, we often see ideas of rapture as being a high state. So I think for now, let's just say we're going to learn a lot more about what does it mean, what does enlightenment mean, what does non-duality mean. I think right now, just be curious and what does it mean to you, right? What kinds of hopes and fears are you projecting onto that idea? Right? How are you making enlightenment into a solution for your current problems rather than a way of being that's completely beyond our hopes and fears? Right? Remember, this is water. So I've already mentioned, right, the path is not for happiness, and I think enlightenment can lead us astray there. And Wikipedia has a nice comment. It says, in the Western world, this concept of spiritual enlightenment has taken on a romantic meaning. It has become synonymous with self-realization, the true self and the false self, and being regarded as substantial essence being covered over by social conditioning. So yes, of course, that's a big part of it. Certainly the inner kind of uncovering and freedom we've talked about. And yes, Buddhism will certainly help you to live more freely in the world. And cultivating the qualities of, kindness and compassion and wisdom and mindfulness can only help you in your relationships and in your work. But there's more, right? There's more. I think I want to bring this up, not just because Rinpoche keeps talking about it, but he always quotes the great yogi Milarepa, who says, "My religion is not deceiving myself and not disturbing others." Because I think there are many temptations to take enlightenment and make it into psychology, right? For those of us who want Buddhism to be a psychology or a science of the mind or something like that. Now, or, Trigam Trungpa Rinpoche, he used to talk about spiritual materialism, the way that we like to follow a spiritual path, including Buddhism, as almost like a fashion statement, right? Part of looking good, part of making ourselves feel good about ourselves, of presenting ourselves to the world with a new, shinier kind of narrative. I think there's another concern a lot of psychologists have pointed to, which is what they call spiritual bypassing, right? The idea of using spirituality as a way to somehow escape the reality of your life and not deal with your very real worldly situation. So another reflection I would invite you to do after this program is just think about what are the ways that you aren't really honest with yourself, and how do you engage in self-deception, especially when it comes to your Buddhist path. Now, in most introductions to Buddhism, you'll find the Buddha's life story. I mean, it's a wonderful story. I mean, we could spend a whole 8 weeks just doing that. And Rinpoche talks about it in his first book, What Makes You Not a Buddhist? I won't go through the whole story now. There's lots of good resources, including that, Rinpoche's book. There's one element I do want to talk about, which is kind of how the path begins. Because the Buddha, it was prophesied at his birth that he would become a world emperor or a Buddha. And his father decided he preferred the career of world emperor. I mean, we might ask ourselves, those parents amongst us, how parents do we really know what's best for our kids? Anyway, so the Buddha's father gave him 3 palaces, supposedly 40,000 dancing girls, to keep his mind attached to the world. But there's the famous story of when he left behind the ordinary life, and before that he went outside the palace with his charioteer, Channa, and he saw the 4 visions of an old person, a sick person, a dead person, and a monk. And his father had very carefully been making sure none of that would be seen inside the palace, just so the Buddha wouldn't get, concerned that there might be something beyond this worldly life and its pleasures. And of course, after seeing these four sights, the Buddha decided to leave the palace. He even left behind his wife and his son. I think for a contemporary reader, it might be easy to see that as narcissism or selfishness or abdication of responsibilities or dropping out. And I think we tend not to understand it as a setting out on a journey to realize truth. But actually, Joseph Campbell, the famous writer of myths and The Hero's Journey, he said, in an interview with Bill Moyers, he said that the guiding idea of his work is to find the commonality of themes in world myths, pointing to a constant requirement in the human psyche for a centering in terms of deep principles. And Moyers asked him, "Are you talking about a search for the meaning of life?" And Campbell said, no, for the experience of being alive. And so I really encourage us to think of the Buddha's life story in that way, as a myth in that sense. And Campbell, when he talked about the hero's journey, always talked about, the archetype of three essential stages. Firstly, departure, sometimes called separation, where we have to leave the ordinary world behind. Right? There's a call to adventure, to head off to the unknown, which at first is very often refused before we finally cross the threshold. Right, then we enter the second stage, which is the trials and the victories, right? The path of initiation, the path of transformation, where the hero or the heroine fights obstacles and enemies in an unknown world. Now, of course, in Buddhism, these enemies aren't external, right? Unlike many myths and legends, they're internal. Right? They're what's going on in our own heart, our own mind. Although even in the life story of the Buddha, those are often personified. For example, at the end where he encountered Mara and his daughters, we can talk about that. And of course, actually throughout Buddhist practice, including in the Vajrayana tradition, where you think of these seemingly external images of sort of gods and demons and Buddhas and all of these things, it's very much an external representation or personification of something inside. So please don't understand it as being something external. So the Buddha, likewise went through his journey. It's a long and lovely story, which ends with him attaining his transformational goal, right? Enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. And then the third stage of the hero's journey is the return and bringing the gift, or the boon, as he calls it, back to society. And again, initially there's a refusal to want to return. Rinpochet often quotes this lovely stanza from the Lalita Vistara Sutra, where the Buddha, after his enlightenment, said, profound and peaceful, free from complexity, uncompounded luminosity. I have found a nectar like Dharma. Yet if I were to teach it, no one would understand. So I shall remain silent here in the forest. And again, according to the traditional story, it took the intervention of the gods Brahma and Indra to ask Buddha, please will you teach? It's the only way to get him to do that. And then finally the story ends with the hero as master of two worlds, right? Both the ordinary and the unknown. He or she, all of us, you end up able to function and be fully present and in the ordinary world, and yet not in any way caught up in it. Right? In the world, but not of the world. But stepping into the unknown, right? How does the journey start? Well, we have to leave our ordinary world behind, right? And that's part, again, of the reason I wanted us to reflect a little on our goals. Are we willing to step outside the goals of our ordinary life? Or do we just want Dharma to help us strive in samsara, better work and marriage and all the rest? And I think the leap of faith needs a certain trust in the hero's journey, right? Knowing that there will be the possibility of return and reintegration at the end. I meet a lot of people who are very worried about starting a spiritual path because they're worried that their ordinary lives are going to fall apart, right? They say, look, I've got a job, I'm a parent, I have a partner, I don't want all of that to disintegrate just because I want to follow a spiritual path. So again, I want to reassure you, it's not a shift in what you do in the world necessarily, but more like a shift in your attitude, a way of relating, a way of being. So in Buddhism, as I mentioned, the traditional marker, the traditional crossing the boundary is taking refuge, right? And what that means is refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, right? The teacher, the teachings, the community. It's saying you're choosing to live by a different role model, a different example, a different set of truths, and a different set of companions from those in your ordinary life. Yeah, I mean, we often hear in psychology that our ordinary lives are strongly determined by our 5 closest people. And so, yeah, if you want to make a change, there is certainly something to be said by cultivating more intentionally some friends who do have an interest that is aligned with yours in pursuing a path that is not just the ordinary worldly path. Now, it's easier to have a clear boundary if you are a monk or a nun, or if you're going into long retreat. Although, of course, even there, you can still be consumed by worldly thoughts. It's harder if you're a householder, right? You'll still have a family and a job, because the boundary is less clear, so there is more opportunity for self-deception. But let's be really, really clear, right? Buddhism is for anyone, for all walks of life. And in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, it's not even that being a monastic is seen as superior. So Rinpoche often gives the role models in the 3 different dhyanas of Buddhism, the 3 different vehicles or paths. So in the basic, the Shravakayana, which is the kind of Buddhism you get in Sri Lanka and a lot of South Asian countries, the role model is someone very peaceful, like Shariputra, a monk, begging bowl, walking softly and gently. Yeah, that's the image we often see also of Buddha portrayed as wearing his robes with his begging bowl. And the Mahayana is much more majestic, much more infinite, right? Rich, like Rinpoche says, like Avalokiteshvara or Vimalakirti. Rinpoche says are a little bit like contemporary rock stars or movie stars or CEOs or billionaires, or indeed kings like Ashoka. Now, so again, the lifestyle here, and these examples very deliberately point us to, we don't have to have a path of renunciation or simplicity in order to be Buddhist. We don't have to give that up. The thing we have to give up is our attachment and our craving. So we're going to talk more about that. I think there's a true story. I think when Rinpoche was much younger, working with Bernardo Bertolucci on his movie The Little Buddha, like a good Italian, Bertolucci said to Rinpoche, he said, "But I am Italian. How can I give up my passion, my emotion?" And Rinpoche said, "It's okay. You can keep your passion. You can keep your emotion. You just have to give up your attachment." So we can reflect more on what that might mean. Just talking more about the 4 signs that the Buddha saw. I think Joseph Campbell talks about this. He says, whether in dream or in myth, in these adventures, there's the atmosphere of irresistible fascination about the figure that appears suddenly as a guide, marking a new period, a new stage in the biography. That which has to be faced, and is somehow profoundly familiar to the unconscious, though unknown, surprising, and even frightening to the conscious personality. It makes itself known, and what formerly was meaningful may become strangely emptied of value. Now, I know a lot of us sometimes feel this way, right? This idea of what is our life really about? Is it really worth striving for all these things I've been striving for? Campbell continues. He says, thereafter, even though the hero returns for a while to his familiar occupations, they may be found unfruitful. A series of signs of increasing force will then become visible until, as in the Buddhist legend of the four signs, I like how he says, it's the most celebrated example of the call to adventure in the literature of the world, and the summons can no longer be denied. Right, again, another really important reflection for us, right? Given that this is a beginning, an introduction. Where has there been that call in our life? It's that call to the adventure of stepping outside ordinary life, of questioning, is it really all that it's cut out to be? You know, are our ordinary purposes really as meaningful as we think? Yeah, so again, I'd like to invite you, when have you had those moments in your life? And when you did have that call, did you listen? Did you act on it? Well, obviously the fact that you're here now says something has touched you, otherwise I'm sure you wouldn't even be here. But I think it's surprising, how often we have something and we don't really embrace it. And even for us who might be here now, how much of our life is really crossing the threshold and embracing the path and the practice, the adventure wholeheartedly, rather than sort of dipping our toe in and sort of timidly standing back at a distance while continuing with ordinary life. It turns out that there's regrets at the end of life, almost all about what we didn't do, all the calls to adventure that we didn't take. Now, there's a well-known book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, written by Bronnie Ware, who's spent a lot of her life in palliative care. And she says, by far and away, the number one regret of people as they die is they say, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life that others expected of me. Yeah, so I think that's, again, really profound to pause for a moment right there. How much of our life right now is just doing things for others? Yeah. Yes, I know, JHT, maybe your comment was easier said than done. Indeed, right? But I think the question is, are we even willing to give it a go? Now, the Buddhist path is not about giving it all up. It's not about becoming a yoga teacher in Costa Rica or writing that book you've always been meaning to write. Because the truth is, those ideas are still within the ordinary samsaric world. By the way, it's not even that you shouldn't do those things. We're talking about this grander adventure, the one that Campbell talks about, right? This hero or heroine's journey, of the journey of transformation. It's difficult because, yes, the lure of conventionality is very strong. Right? Our life habits are very strong. But, again, even in contemporary language, we talk about wake-up calls. So yes, how can we learn to listen? And just to close this first teaching, and we'll have the Q&A shortly, just to say that, as Campbell said, right, the end of the path, strangely, brings us back into the ordinary world. Right? The end looks, in many ways, like the beginning. Indeed, the place may not even have changed. The thing that has changed is you, right? You have changed. Right? This is the idea of transformation. And we'll talk about this more in the next session. But I'd like to leave just a couple of quotes just on this topic. So one from the French writer Marcel Proust. He says, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeing new sights, but in looking with new eyes. Notice that even there he has the idea of view, right? The idea of how we see the world. And one of my favorites, so T.S. Eliot, from his poem Little Gidding, which is part of the 4 quartets. I've always loved this verse. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. So that's very much what I hope we shall get out of these 8 weeks together. Thank you. The Q&A will start in 10 minutes. If you have any questions, please add them to the link. The video will be up on YouTube after, and I very much hope we will start a dialogue with each other, build a community here to really support each other in this journey, this adventure. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again. All right, so welcome back. And I saw Sarah ask the question, how long is the Q&A? Well, I've set aside an hour. I don't know if we'll need it all, but I'm certainly prepared to be here for the hour. I suspect we might want to today because there's a lot of questions that were from the registration also, and I'll go through some of those. Let me go through them in the order they appeared on the form. So first question was from Paduma, who said they have experienced a childhood trauma and emotional neglect since they were young and have the tendency to brush away and refuse to feel emotions and focus logically instead, therefore, on what needs to be done. And the question was, will this affect my spiritual practice? I mean, obviously, so practice questions, I should just say in advance, they're very individual, right? It's not as though I can give a perfect answer without really knowing you and your circumstances much more deeply. And even then, you know, the whatever answer I might give would probably be much less skillful than an answer that someone like Rinpochet might give. But nevertheless, what I will say is we all come to our practice, you know, with ignorance, with negative emotions, with cognitive and emotional defilements, whatever they may be, right? So maybe to the person asking the question, maybe you feel yours are perhaps more serious in some respects than that of others. But I mean, I have known and have friends with all manner of trauma in their lives who have been and are wonderful practitioners. I think, if anything, part of it is just to be able just to take whatever your circumstances are as the basis for your practice, right? In the sense that we all have what we need with the existing stuff of our lives, right? We don't need to become someone else before we can start. Yeah, we're all equally broken and equally perfect, right? In that sense that we are all just as good as one another as vessels for the path. So I suspect there's a lot more behind your question, but just the brief answer will be, yes, it will affect your spiritual practice in the sense that whatever we bring to our path will affect our practice. I mean, this is part of causes and conditions. But I think the sense you meant it in is, will I somehow be less able to practice? And there I would say, definitely not. You are as able as anyone else. All right, next question is from Stella. And she says, could I talk a little bit about the importance of the Ninja practice in Tibetan Buddhism and why not every teacher requires it? Now, I did say I wasn't going to talk about Vajrayana, and I saw a couple of people on the chat were actually saying, well, maybe I should because it's so misunderstood. So I hear that, and I agree with that sentiment also. I think this question's okay, right? Because it's not a question about the sort of elements of the practice which are liable to be misunderstood by the general public. So I will answer, and I will say, well, briefly, what is Ninja in Tibetan Buddhism? It's a set of preliminary practices where you're training different aspects of your mind, right? I mean, all of Buddhism, it comes down to mind training in various manifestations. Training, you know, in patience, in generosity, in discipline. I mean, these are the sort of outer qualities, the paramitas and so forth. Training in meditation, right? In shamatha, in stability, in vipassana, in learning to cultivate insight and see the truth. Training in wisdom, right? And as you go into the Vajrayana especially, the methods for doing this become much richer. So, for example, you know, we use visualization, we use mantra, We use mudra or gesture. There are many techniques. And I particularly, from the perspective of sort of thinking about the skillful means that we have in the Western world, I find the Vajrayana method to be amazing because we don't. I mean, the West. I mean, I'm pleased, by the way, if anyone listening has different perspectives, I'd love to hear this. But my sense is we don't have a lot of ways of training in non-duality. We'll talk more about what that means, right? The term non-duality. But basically, Rinpoche says it's this idea that something can simultaneously be there and not there at the same time, right? The example is often used of illusion. But go to a movie theater, watch a movie. The experience, what you see on the screen feels very real, and your emotional reality is very real. And yet we know it's just a movie, right? But this idea of visualization allows you to do the two steps of consciously creating this illusion, and then consciously dissolving the delusion, right? So in Vajrayana, these two steps are called creation and completion, or dissolution. I think it's amazing, right? Because there's something about intentionally creating a visualization where you know it's not real, but at the same time you're doing it for very intentional purposes. I think that is an incredibly skillful way of helping us learn to understand the ways in which things can appear without being real. Because we're very intentional and very conscious about the way we're constructing our reality. And so again, I'm not sure the West has that. But, so to go to Stella, your question, do we need Nindro? In some respects, I could answer it several ways. In some respects, the Nindro is already a complete path, right? So you could almost ask, well, do we need anything beyond the Nindro? Because if that's all you practice, that's already a complete path. I think another way of saying it is, well, many of the things that we learn in the Nindro, we repeat, perhaps, in our next set of practices. I think the challenge is, if you miss out on a Nindro, you haven't had much grounding in the preparatory or preliminary steps. It would be a bit like saying if I was a pianist and you were to ask me, well, do you need to practice playing your scales? And I suppose technically I could say, well, no, I could go straight to trying to play, a Beethoven piano concerto. The difficulty would be if I move too quickly to the concerto and I don't have my foundations, I could be wasting a lot of time, right? A completely different example, but one I like to use is, Tiger Woods, the golfer. Very famously, when he was, top of the world, decided to reinvent his golf swing because he could see that it was not what he wanted it to be. And so he reworked it, and basically it kind of took a whole season before he was back at his best, right? He really took a dip in his performance. Likewise, again, if you're a pianist and you learn the wrong fingering for a piece, to relearn the fingering is very, very difficult because by the time you've learned to play a piece, it's all part of your intuitive muscle memory. Right? It's the same with practice. It's the same with golf, of course. We learn a way of practicing when we do our preliminaries or our early practices. And it's, I would say, very helpful for us to come to our later parts of the path having learned good foundations. Because trying to unlearn or relearn, if you realize you're not doing it the way you now see you need to, that can be a big obstacle. So now, some teachers require it, some teachers don't. That every teacher teaches the path in a different way. I'm certainly not going to comment on whether there is a right or a wrong answer here. I will say for me, I am extremely grateful for the idea of Nindro. I think it's extremely useful. And if you aspire to go on to a Vajrayana practice, then I would say yes, I personally would recommend it. Okay, next question was from Yeshi, I'm guessing Bhutan, who says, in what way can we help our parents through Buddhism? A nice question. Yeah, I would say it's actually no different to the way we can help anyone else through Buddhism. I think the way I like to think about it is in the book The Words of My Perfect Teacher by Patrul Rinpoche. It's a Tibetan book. When he talks about what it is to benefit others, he talks about three different kinds of helping or benefit. And one is, again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? The outer, the inner, the innermost. The outer is material generosity. So how can you help your parents? Well, you can give things to them. I mean, you can cook them dinner, you can buy them gifts, you can give them money if they need money, whatever it might be, right? So for sure, you can take care of them as they become elderly. I mean, there are many practical things one can do. The second domain is the inner domain, right? So just as we discussed, it's the domain of psychology, of emotion, of experience. Patrul Rinpoche talks about it as giving people freedom from fear. It's a nice framing. And actually, a lot of the contemporary work on psychology turns out that one of the most important foundations for any relationship is what is called psychological safety. Right? This idea that I can say what I want to say around you without feeling that you're going to judge or criticize me, right? That I'm free to be myself, that you will accept me fully and wholeheartedly for who I am. And not to say that I may not wish to change and become a better version of myself, but nevertheless, as of now, you will accept me. And by the way, this is a lot. I mean, some of you also asked about self-compassion. This is very similar to thinking in those teachings too. So I would say the second thing you can do for your parents is ask yourself, what are you doing for their happiness? And I don't necessarily mean doing outer things to make them happy, but I mean creating an environment of psychological safety for them. Do they feel, especially around you, they can be who they want to be? Are you creating an environment of acceptance, of trust, of genuine loving kindness and compassion? So you might want to consider that. And the third one, it's the hardest, is corresponds to this innermost domain. But Patrul Rinpoche says the highest gift we can give anybody is the gift of truth. Now, of course, he's referring to the Dharma. And I don't think he's saying any of us should go out and evangelize. And Rinpoche would say the same. It's not as if we should become like, kind of extremist Buddhist trying to convert the world. In fact, Rinpoche says, our aim as a Buddhist is never that the whole world should become Buddhist. It's that they should all become Buddhas, right? We want their enlightenment. We're not particular about how they get there. But so for your parents, I guess that there may be some part of it which is, I don't know whether there is something in them which is attracted to the Dharma, and if so, whether there's some way you could share some of that with them. I mean, sometimes truth is just ordinary worldly truth, right? Sometimes it helps to have a good friend be very honest with us about how we're choosing to live our lives. And that can sometimes be the very wake-up call that we need to start taking better care and thinking a little more about our purpose and are we really living the way we would like to. So maybe there's some of that. But I would say actually the best way of bringing the Dharma to anyone, indeed, is to live it yourself. And Rinpoche talks about this also in the sense of how can we be good parents to our children. I think it's the same as being good children to our parents. I think it comes down to how well can we embody the Dharma? How well can we live the Dharma? Because honestly, the best way to inspire anyone else is to be a living example of the thing we say we stand for. Because if we're just giving, an intellectual dry lecture when they can look at us and it's quite clear that we don't actually live anything that we're saying, won't really inspire, won't really help. So that's some thoughts, Yoshi, for you. Udim asked a question, how is a root teacher different from other teachers from whom we receive different teachings? Again, this is a bit technical and a bit Vajrayana, but I would say the technical answer is your root teacher is the one who gives you the highest empowerment. Now, since that's a more technical Vajrayana question, I think we should come back to it in a more closed group if we would like. Angela asks, does one have to be vegetarian to practice Buddhism? That's a very good question, very common question actually. And this is one of these ones where we're really going to sort of meet non-duality very head on. Because whichever way I answer, I'm going to get into trouble, right? If I tell you have to be, well, that's not strictly true. But if I tell you it doesn't matter, that's also not strictly true. So I just want to give that as a sort of warning before I start. I will say also, there are some paths or some traditions within Buddhism which do require it as a precursor for the path. And indeed, even in Tibetan Buddhism, there are certain practices or certain sadhanas or deities that you might wish to practice, where in order to do the practice, you have to commit to being vegetarian for the duration of that practice or that retreat, right? So certainly one can't generalize. I think at an outer level, of course, we're invited to consider what is our impact on other sentient beings, right? And I think anyone who spent any time looking at the suffering of animals that go into our factory food system, if you've seen any of the documentaries, and if you haven't, I mean, I recommend it to you, even though it's quite horrific. I think it's actually, that alone may make you reconsider how much you're willing to eat meat. So I think the bigger question then is, as you think about, what to you does it mean to live a good and wholesome and beneficial life? How important is it for you? Again, there's no answer. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. And the truth is, we don't even necessarily know. I mean, which beings is it acceptable to eat or not eat? I mean, is it okay to eat fish because we think they're less sentient than cows? What about locusts? I mean, what about just eating crushed up locust meal? I mean, is that okay? Do insects somehow come lower on the hierarchy? Or do we really treat every sentient being the same way? I think the bigger thing, though, that Rinpoche would always say on this is never to let our path become fundamentalist, right? And certainly never to let it become moralistic. So even if you're doing it for yourself, I think a much bigger challenge many of us face is that we start to wear it as a badge of honor, or we start to try and persuade people in our lives that they too should do what we're doing. And then it very easily can slip away from being a personal practice and into being just more, samsaric game playing. So, I think be wary. I think, as a Buddhist in general, would it be fair to say that it is good to treat animals well and therefore not to kill and eat them? I mean, it's hard to argue with that. Yeah. But at the same time, does one have to be vegetarian to be Buddhist? Definitely not. Far more important that one develops the view of non-duality. All right, Preet has a good, but the question, I think it'll take us longer than we have to explain. In terms of rebirth, if there is no soul or no self, what is being reborn? Yeah, very good question. So this is indeed one of these questions that invites us to step outside our standard rational way of thinking. I won't give you the answer. In fact, I almost don't want to, because this has been one of my questions, or was one of my questions, for more than 20 years with Rinpoche. And actually one of the things that I really appreciate is that he never gave me an answer. And initially I found it quite infuriating, because I'm like, well, come on, there has to be a good answer to this question. Surely it's a common question. And then I realized actually over time, well, firstly I realized I came to understand my question in a very different way. And I don't want to take that opportunity away from you. But I think also a good question, again, it goes back to the Chinese and the Japanese, the Chan and the Zen traditions, where they have one of the purposes of a koan, right? Any question which you keep bringing up over and over and over again because you can't find a rational answer, keeps it top of mind. They say it should almost be like holding a ball of boiling metal in your throat, right? You just don't know what to do with it, but it's there all the time. You can't get rid of it. Interestingly, these kinds of questions, part of what makes them so powerful is that they are transformative. And so I almost don't want to answer it for you, Preet. In fact, I almost suggest to you, I don't even necessarily want you to try and come up with an overly quick or intellectual answer for yourself. Maybe I'd invite you to take it as your personal koan, right? Allow yourself to be incredibly frustrated by the question, to be, frustrated that there is no rational answer, to keep coming back to it and to let that work on you. And I can tell you in my case, my interaction with that question has certainly been very beneficial for me. I suspect it would be for you also. Michaela asks, from when onwards can one be considered as a Vajrayana practitioner? Practicing ninja or having received Abhisheka? Yeah, I think, again, there's no super strict answer for this. I think it really is between you and your teacher, or even between you and yourself. Because really, at the end of the day, if you determine that you wish to follow the path, that aspiration alone makes you a Vajrayana practitioner, right? If you want to follow the Vajrayana path, even if you haven't yet met a teacher, even if you haven't yet received an empowerment, even if you haven't done your first mantra, right? Now, of course, all these things like mantras, empowerments, all of these things, they help to further the commitment and further the identity. And certainly, many teachers won't allow you to attend certain kinds of teachings unless you have had certain empowerments or done certain kinds of retreats or practices. So there are some very real precursors. But I do also want to just caution you, Michaela, not that you're saying this, but I know so many people do like this idea of putting on the Vajrayana identity as a badge of honor. And again, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I would almost say, find out from your teacher what he or she feels they would like you to do, and then follow that, and maybe not worry quite so much about the demarcation or the identity. Edith, I respect that Rinpoche insists on not talking about Vajrayana Buddhism in public. Given there's so much confusion and misunderstanding nowadays, should this be discussed more in public? This helps a healthy development of Vajrayana. Without a clearer picture, how can people be blamed for jumping into the tradition because of a guru's fame? She says, I did watch his recent talk on poisonous medicine. Yeah, no, look, I think it's an excellent point. I agree, which is part of the reason Rinpoche is talking about it more. I also feel very strongly about this, and I very much agree with what you're saying, Edith. And so a future course that I may put together would be to really try and talk about Vajrayana, but both in the sense of clearing up the confusion, but also I think in helping people appreciate the psychological significance of the Vajrayana methods, right? Because I think we don't really talk about that very much in the Vajrayana. So I think often people look at the methods as being a bit strange and foreign. And I think we don't actually pause to say, wow, they are incredible as skillful means, right? Especially, as I mentioned earlier, as skillful means for practicing non-duality. So yeah, it's a great question. And again, with all these kinds of things that I mentioned about, things that may be of interest to you, please, I want to encourage anyone who's listening, please do let me know going forwards, not just within these 8 weeks, but going forwards, what are the things that you would like more on? Because I'd be glad to provide it. Next question, Sherab says, is nationalism or patriotism against the fundamentals of Buddhism? What did Buddha have to say on the subject? I'm asking this as a Tibetan Buddhist whose people yearn for Tibet's independence. Can a true Buddhist ever be patriotic? Yeah, well, so I think, again, many answers. So I'll give two. I'd say one answer, of course, as a true Buddhist, we shouldn't be caught up in anything in the world, right? Those worldly concerns, I was talking about all of that earlier, that's part of what we're trying to transcend. And the more that we just get caught up in that, the less we'll be doing our practice. But the flip side is, it's the same, I think, argument a lot of engaged Buddhists make. Yes, we shouldn't be caught up in the world, but there's no question that our worldly circumstances make a huge difference to the opportunities that we have, not just for ordinary, economic material life, but for our happiness and, of course, for our ability to practice the Dharma. And in fact, the traditional teaching in Buddhism is that there are 6 realms you could be reborn into, right? You could be the gods, you can be the demigods, you can be humans, that's the 3rd realm. You can be animals, you can be hungry ghosts, which are kind of demon, and then you can be born into a hell. And again, in the traditional teachings, the 6 realms teaching is all about, how your current incarnation or birth is a function of your previous actions, which was something that really made sense for people living in pre-modern societies. Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, actually he took the teachings on the 6 realms and reinterpreted it very much in a modern psychological way. So I think even from a master in a traditional lineage, we realize there may be other ways of interpreting these teachings. But I think the interesting thing for me is that out of the 6 realms, even though you might think, oh, surely the God is the best, actually it turns out that's not the best realm. The best realm is the human realm. And you might ask, well, why would that be? Well, because if you're in the so-called lower realms, like the hell realms, it's a bit like being born into a very difficult material situation as a human, right? You don't have the time to devote yourself to higher pursuits, as Maslow pointed out, if you're living in the middle of a war zone and you can't find food and water and things like that, right? So, the lower realms are difficult because the circumstances to practice and hear teachings are difficult. But the higher realms are difficult in a different way. And again, if one were to look at Hollywood, look at CEOs, look at the worlds of rich and famous people, they have all kinds of other ways of getting caught up and distracted. Yes, of course they suffer, but you could argue perhaps they're not suffering enough in the right kinds of ways to turn their minds to the Dharma. And the human realm is praised simply because it's the realm where you have enough suffering to make you aware that there's something to work on, but enough freedom that you actually have the ability to do it. So I say all of that to go back to your point about Tibet, because I do think, whatever else we might say, there's no question that Tibet was a repository of the Dharma for many centuries, right? Of holding the living lineages of the Vajrayana where they had died out in many other places. And if not for Tibet, we wouldn't have the Dharma that we have today. So no question about that, right? And so in that sense, we not just should, but have to care for the external environment. The idea that places like Tibet matter because it makes a difference to the Dharma, to what we're handing on to future generations, right? Their own ability to hear and receive and practice the teachings. So yes. Again, does that mean we should be nationalistic? I don't think I would ever recommend nationalism, but I think in the same way, one can be an engaged Buddhism and seek to make for better circumstances in the outer world so that they might support greater happiness, and even more so that they might support people's path to enlightenment. I think absolutely. A question from Indy. How do you develop a relationship with the teacher when there are so many other people who also want to develop a relationship with the teacher as well? Gosh, it's what a difficult question. I honestly don't know how most teachers handle this. In my experience with Rinpoche, especially if you are able to come to an in-person teaching, there's usually an opportunity to put your name on a list for a brief audience with him. And almost always he will make the time to see everyone on the list. Right? So it is possible. But again, I can't speak for what happens with other people. And I think you may be asking, well, Indy, I mean, does that count as a relationship? Yeah, I mean, tricky, right? I mean, back to this point about what does it take to have a moment that turns you to this transformational path? Or if you're already on the Dharma path, how can just a moment take you to a completely different level? There's no question that can happen, right? So I would never discount even a brief moment with a teacher. There's another lovely story Rinpochet tells, one of my favorites, where he talks about, and actually this can also go back to the previous question, Yeshi's question on how to help our parents, because it's a question about helping, right? And as a bodhisattva, our aspiration being to liberate all sentient beings. And I think many of us interpret that in a kind of maximalist, completely overwhelming sense of like, oh my gosh, there's almost 8 billion people on this earth. And in the limited years I have left on the planet, even if I tried, there's no way I could individually even say hello to everyone, let alone liberate them all, right? So that's obviously insane, right? How could I do that? So I think, again, this is a very wonderful teaching in non-duality, actually. We'll talk about it more in future weeks. But the story I want to tell is Rinpoche says, maybe as a bodhisattva, your whole life really came down to one interaction with one person where you really touched them and made a difference for them. So he gives example. He says, maybe you're a bodhisattva and you aspire to be reborn in so I can never remember if it's Marrakesh or Casablanca, but anyway, somewhere in Morocco, to be working in a little coffee house, because that in roughly 25 years' time, someone's going to be in that coffee house ready to be turned to the Dharma. And so, you take birth as a human, you go through school, you train as a barista, you end up at this coffee house, and there, 25 years later, there is this person. And you make them their espresso. And in that interaction, in those few seconds you share together, something is exchanged. Maybe a word is spoken. Maybe some way of your being is transmitted that touches them, and that becomes the seed. That becomes the catalyst that allows them to then find and enter the path and practice and then eventually attain enlightenment. Now, so you might say, oh gosh, me serving them a coffee, but what if that was the very seed that unlocked the entirety of their path? Yeah, supremely important. And I think, again, as bodhisattvas, those of us following the Mahayana path, I think that mindset is a really wonderful mindset to take with you. Just this sense that every single person you meet could be a chance for you to touch them. And I don't mean by giving them some big lecture on Buddhist philosophy. No, I don't mean that. I mean just in the simple way of your being, right? Just who you are speaks so much more loudly than what you say. And there's something about, whether it is your kindness or compassion, or perhaps your mindfulness in your presence, or perhaps something about your wisdom, that just touches the other person. And just imagine if you could throw yourself into your life with that kind of attitude, such that every person was somebody that you could potentially be that for. I mean, I think you would find it would really change the way you saw other people. And I think a lot of the familiar ways of relating as a friend or an enemy or an obstacle or somebody who can do something useful for you, I think you might find a lot of that would start to dissolve. So just a thought. So I say all of that, Indy, just to make the point that if you can take that attitude with others, I can be fairly sure that if you meet a good teacher, they're going to be taking that attitude with you. So Aditi asks a question. When you mention going beyond rationality, it strikes me as saying that humanity should fill in the gaps, the unknown and unknowable, given current capabilities, with something. Why can't we be content with the unknown? I'd rather not make up something to fill the gaps for my satisfaction and comfort and completeness. Yeah, no, a good question. And I think, Aditi, perhaps you misunderstood what I was saying, or perhaps I was not clear. I'm saying that there are three different levels, right? It's a little bit like when we talk about the outer, the inner, and the innermost. I'm saying there's the irrational, the rational, and the beyond rational. So I'm not saying we should stay at the level of rationality and put more content in the space. No. I'm saying that beyond rational is saying there's another level, beyond, literally above the world of rationality. Well, like I said, we'll talk more about transformation next week. But I'll give you an example right now, just to make the point, right? Rinpochet often uses the analogy of a bird's eye view, right? The idea of taking a big picture view, a vision, as he calls it, rather than just sort of getting caught up in seeing the details and missing things. There's actually a lovely example from Western leadership theory. I mean, there's a guy called Ron Heifetz at Harvard. He came up with this example of, he calls it the balcony and the dance floor, which is it's this very point. And he says, imagine you're going to some kind of club, right? Some kind of dance club, one of the bigger ones where there are more than one level, right? So there is a floor, and above there's some kind of balcony where you can look down. And he says, well, contrast those two experiences, right? When you're on the dance floor, what do you experience? Well, I mean, you experience, of course, the music. You experience all the people right around you, their movement. You experience the attraction, maybe some sexual passion, maybe some delight, some joy, maybe, the smell of perfume or sweat. I mean, who knows? But you're very much caught in an immediate sensory world, right? Go up on the balcony, you see very different things, right? You can see the shape of the whole dance floor. You can see the different kinds of people. You can see the way different groups are formed. If you're so inclined, you can see where all the cute boys or the cute girls might be, right? You have a different perspective, right? So it's this kind of idea that separates rational with beyond rational, right? It's this idea of getting up above your previous way of seeing. And in fact, one way that you can tell is that you have developed, if you go to Western logic and philosophy like Hegel and Fichte, they talked about this idea of synthesis, right? So, in Western logic, you talk about you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, but you can argue which is right and which is wrong, which is the level of debate, of argument, and so on and so forth. But you can also step above the two to create a so-called synthesis, right? And a synthesis is a bigger frame of reference, a bigger view, where you can hold the thesis and hold the antithesis at the same time, right? And that is the characteristic of a synthesis, right? It allows you to integrate things that previously seemed incompatible or opposed. So similarly, right, the idea of rational and irrational are currently opposed. But if we can transcend to going beyond rationality, we can see a way that we can hold both of them without getting caught in either. So very specifically, back to your question then, Aditi, we're not trying to fill in the gaps, right? That's just another playing in the domain of rationality. And it's not even about being content with the unknown, because that's, again, still in the domain of what we know. It's the knowable or the unknown. I'm saying it's about looking at our whole relationship to things that we know, to rationality, to phenomena themselves, right? And in fact, from a Buddhist point of view, that's where it becomes really important, right? Because, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about Vipassana, right? Because in the four foundations of mindfulness, the fourth and final foundation is phenomena themselves. And And that's the most difficult one, and the one that we get the most caught in. Right? This idea of a self, this idea that there are real phenomenal objects out there. And it's the ability to go to have a different relationship to our experience, right? In philosophical terms, to our ontology. So yeah, don't try and fill in the gaps. Don't just be content with the gaps. It's about going beyond the gaps and the non-gaps. Edith's question, can we discuss examples of non-duality in real life? We'll come to that next week. Abby, in what ways do you think the rise of technology, specifically social media, will impact those who seek to follow Buddhism? I'm concerned about the mental load created by an influx of non-stop media exposure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a huge amount being written right now, part of which actually stems from the contemporary interest in mindfulness, but about, as I mentioned, about technology and distraction and addiction, as in the way that tech companies are engineering addiction of our awareness and attention, right, for their commercial purposes. So do I think technology is going to be a problem? Absolutely, right? So I think, well, how does that play out? I think, the good way is the fact that, right now, here we are, we're enjoying the fruits of technology in such a way that it's serving the Dharma, I hope, at least. So that I think is a good thing, and I hope and imagine that will continue. I think it's very clear we're going to see things getting a lot worse with the abuse and misuse of social media, virtual reality, especially artificial intelligence, because there's just too much money to be made and too much political power to be gained from these tools. So regrettably, and there's so little regulation that, unless a political miracle happens overnight, which I sincerely doubt, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So I think one way that'll affect the Dharma is I think the problem will become much more immediate and much more intense. And I suspect, that could have, I mean, it's unpredictable what that's going to do, right? I mean, it may create a spur of new interest. I mean, I think it's not insignificant that if you go to Silicon Valley, pretty much all of the leading tech entrepreneurs, they won't let their own kids use iPhones. All right, they really want schools like Montessori schools or schools where there's next to no technology in the classroom. Right, and these are the people at the very heart, right, the belly of the beast. They know what they're building, and they don't want it for their own kids. Right, so I think. And I think, maybe we're early days yet of people starting to really ask themselves whether they have had enough of technology. I think the part that does worry me, as I said earlier, is it's like food. I mean, we know much of the commercial food is engineered to make us addicted to it. It doesn't stop obesity. And if anything, I think, unfortunately, there's been a normalization of obesity. I worry a little bit we may see something similar with, attention. I think for anyone, who wants to see where this could go, I think if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, right? When he talks about soma, this idea of an addictive substance, I think we are engineering our worlds to become ever more addictive. I think we'll need to respond. I think another very good writer for those interested is the historian, the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who, by the way, also happens to be a mindfulness practitioner. But he writes, I think, very wisely about how we are really going to have to take more responsibility for our own wisdom and our own awareness and our own mindfulness, given that the world is going to become increasingly unfriendly in that respect. So I guess my answer, Abby, to your question is I think it's both a threat and an opportunity. It's beyond my pay grade to know which way it's going to go. I hope, if nothing else, it will turn people more towards the Dharma. Of course, I hope even more so that those in power in government and in Silicon Valley can see beyond just getting us all addicted. But who knows? Let's see. Okay, George. Oh no, sorry. Before George, Floridalva. Question about the most common regret and bodhicitta. Could you elaborate a little bit? Oh gosh, Floridalva, I'm not sure what you want me to say. Could you put an additional comment in the chat, and I'll try and understand. If you're still there. Well, I'll keep my eye open and see if you wrote anything. George question. I'm a little confused. You said that the innermost is going beyond self, where there is just your awareness, paraphrased. Isn't this a contradiction, as your awareness implies there is a self to be aware? Yes, well, indeed not, George. So no, I think you remember that quote I gave you from Michael Pollan? I should read it again because I like it so much. Let me find it for you. Yeah, so he said, the sense of merging into some larger totality is, of course, one of the hallmarks of the mystical experience. Our sense of individuality and separateness hinges on a bounded self and a clear demarcation between subject and object. But all that may be a mental construction, a kind of illusion, just as the Buddhists have been trying to tell us. The psychedelic experience of non-duality suggests that consciousness survives the disappearance of the self, that it is not so indispensable as we and it like to think. And that, George, is the answer. Yeah, it's very possible to have a consciousness and awareness without self. So, yeah. And I think the other way around of saying it is that self is part of the content, yeah, that manifests within the container that is awareness. Now, for the Madhyamaka philosophers amongst you, I know you're going to complain about my language of contents and container, but I still think it's helpful to think about that, right? But just to say, yes, absolutely, we do as Buddhists aspire to go beyond the self. At very minimum, to go beyond a fixed self, and eventually to go beyond all self. Let me just double check. Nope, nothing from Floridalva. Nick, perhaps my question seems a bit philosophical, but it's actually practical for me as I rethink my work life. You mentioned the idea that Buddhism isn't going to begrudge people for using it for whatever purpose they want. Did you mean to leave that as open-ended? It seems to me that someone could misuse the understandings of the human experience from the Buddha as tools to manipulate others in self-serving ways. Like an AI run by some Facebook-like app that consumes just enough of the understandings and practices to drive behaviors in the world to benefit the corporation. How could it be that someone who takes refuge in the Dharma doesn't at least make efforts to align their external world with the fundamental values derived from the Dharma? No, absolutely, and I'm sorry if I implied otherwise. No, I think in the very much the hierarchy of the Dharma, and actually this is something also I'd like to talk about next time. It's one of the famous lines, actually in one of the most basic Buddhist teachings, but when they talk about the kind of hierarchy of how we should think about engaging with the world, it's first do no harm, then seek to do good, and then finally train your mind, right? But this idea of starting with doing no harm, just like the Hippocratic oath that doctors would take, that's absolutely foundational. So yes, as a Buddhist, we should for sure aim that our activities in the world cause no harm. No material harm, no psychological harm, no harm, as best we can understand it. And of course, sometimes that's hard and we cannot predict everything. I think the question you're asking is a little different though, because regrettably not everyone in Silicon Valley is a Buddhist. And I do think it's quite possible, much in the same way that I think our understanding of psychology and our understanding of mindfulness is being taken into places that are perhaps contrary to their original Buddhist intention. I think it's very possible we may find some teachings from Buddhism to be used in a manipulative way. I guess all we can do is do our best to practice the teachings authentically ourselves. And then if solving that kind of worldly problem is of interest to us, then absolutely I would encourage us to get engaged and try and solve that. Matthias, could you tell us more about taking refuge? When I'm saying to myself that I'm taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, it feels somehow fabricated and abstract because I know very well that I'm more attached to the ordinary daily world I'm living in. So maybe taking refuge is more like an aspiration, consciously knowing it's not the case right now, to only surrender to Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, my true nature, my real inner self at last, instead of clinging to all the objects of the outer world, as it is in my current situation. I think you've answered your own question, Matthias. Yes, I think that's very well put. I can indeed talk more about refuge. I won't do so now because to do it justice would take longer. But I think Rinpochet likes to say this. He says, look, there's a reason we call it a practice, right? Because we're not there yet. If we had already attained perfection in our practice, even perfection in our taking refuge, we wouldn't need to practice, right? So part of the challenge is that even if we understand it intellectually, our lived emotional internalization of that is very different, right? As you say, we may know we wish to follow the truth of the Dharma, but we find ourselves caught up in samsara. That's normal. So yes, a large part of the practice is cultivating aspiration. And in fact, Rinpoche will often say when he teaches the Mahayana path, he will say, to talk about ultimate bodhicitta as a non-duality is kind of beyond us. Even to talk about the bodhicitta of application, right, the 6 paramitas, that's hard. That's a lot of work. It takes time. It takes energy. It's a real commitment to attain some kind of mastery on that path. Whereas aspiration, he said, you can always aspire, right? There's no excuse. It's painless, it takes no time, you can fit it in wherever you like in your day, right? And the same is true with taking refuge. I think the intention, if nothing else, the intention to live according to truth, I think that already is huge, yeah? Even if all you're doing is acknowledging to yourself, wow, maybe some of the things I'm doing today may indeed be a little bit deluded, right? Maybe I'm a little bit just too caught up in the rat race. And even just the reminder, back to the hero's journey, right? Even just the reminder that there is a possibility of living in a different way, even that's very powerful. Even if your life circumstances don't permit you yet to necessarily embark on the path. Okay, Ima asks the question. Let me see. She says, most of us are practicing alone. To have contact or be with the Dharma teacher seems so difficult nowadays. How do we know that we are on the right path and not making another layer of delusion, a kind of bypass? Really, really, really good question. Really good question. I know one thing Rinpoche likes to say with that one is he always says, I want you to always have that concern. Because if nothing else, it's a chance that you're going to keep yourself honest, right? I think much more dangerous is if you lull yourself into thinking there's no problem, right? So yes, you can and should have that concern. But of course, practically speaking, you are going to want some help, right? And I think for that purpose, I think finding Sangha, right? Finding community is really helpful. And if you don't have a local teacher or a local Sangha, let's see, perhaps, the community that's starting to build here is going to be the possibility for people to find ways of supporting each other. Rinpoche has been talking a lot recently about the idea of the Kalyana Mitra. So the original idea in the early Buddhist teachings of a spiritual friend. It's just before, we had the idea of gurus. And the way people would relate to one another in the Sangha was they would seek to be spiritual friends to one another. Right, so in the same way that if you think about who are your best friends today, right? Who are, and what makes them a good friend? And I think it'll go back to this idea of the three kinds of ways of helping, right? They'll probably help you in an outward way. They'll probably help you in an inward way, right, psychologically. And, hopefully they'll be telling you truth. And I really believe we can come together to do that, including virtually, including digitally, for each other as a sangha, right? And I certainly, if this thing we're starting here now can in any way support that, I would be very eager to help, because I think this is so important, as you're saying. And I think it goes also back to what I said before, right? This idea of becoming a coach to oneself is really important, and it's also very difficult, right? There's very few true solitary geniuses in the world. I mean, most people who are engaged in some kind of path of mastery are part of some kind of community of practice, right? So I think the more that we can create that kind of community where we can ask each other questions, we can share our understandings, we can, ask each other difficult questions, we can point out when it feels like another person's understanding may actually be a misunderstanding. I think having those kinds of dialogues, I mean, to me, that really is the essence of a virtuous friendship, right? And I know Rinpoche is really encouraging that. So, and he's saying, look, how can we find a way to enable that to really become part of our ordinary worldly life, such that even, people in society, doctors, teachers, CEOs, they start to see that as part of what their role actually might involve. So, let me see, I think we have come to the end of the questions on today's. I haven't even started the list of questions on the sign-up form, so let me just see if there's any others in the live chat. A couple of you, and actually also in the registration, asked for references, reading. Could I give you that? I'll do my best, absolutely, yes. So Sarah, that's your question, and you're welcome. I will certainly do that. Anyone else got a question here that I can answer? I don't think so. So I think in that sense, I will give you back the last 2 minutes of this hour. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. The teaching will be posted on the website, on YouTube. I do aspire at some point to transcribe it. I don't know when I'll be able to do that. Please continue to encourage people. If you feel this is helpful, let them know. As you can tell, I really value this path and these teachings, and really aspire that we can make them available to whoever might be interested. And one of the wonderful things about the virtual medium is it's a very easy way of doing it. So thanks again, all of you who stayed for the full 3 hours, for your participation, and I look forward to connecting with you during the week and to seeing you again next week. So with that, goodbye.